Jim Rickards, the US must turn to Russia to contain China. Jim says it's 2 against 1, and the US is currently the odd man out. Here's why the US needs to team up with Russia to counter China. By Jim Rickards of Daily Reckoning. Vladimir Putin stands accused in the media and global public opinion of rigging his recent re-election, imprisoning his political enemies, murdering Russian spies turned double agent, meddling in Western elections, seizing Crimea, destabilizing Ukraine, supporting a murderous dictator in Syria and exporting arms to terrorist nations like Iran. At the same time, the country of Russia is more than Mr. Putin, despite his authoritarian and heavy-handed methods. Russia is the world's 12th largest economy, with a GDP in excess of $1.5 trillion, larger than many developed economies such as Australia, number 13, Spain, number 14, and the Netherlands, number 18. Its export sector produces a positive balance of trade for Russia, currently running at over $16 billion per month. Russia has not had a trade deficit in over 20 years. Russia is also the world's largest oil producer, with output of 10.6 million barrels per day, larger than both Saudi Arabia and the United States. Russia has the largest landmass of any country in the world and a population of 144 million people, the 9th largest of any country. Russia is also the 3rd largest gold-producing nation in the world, with total production of 250 tons per year, about 8% of total global output and solidly ahead of the US, Canada, and South Africa. Russia is highly competitive in the export of nuclear power plants, advanced weaponry, space technology, agricultural products, and it has an educated workforce. Russia's government debt-to-GDP ratio is 12.6%, which is trivial compared with 253% for Japan, 105% for the United States and 68% for Germany. Russia's external dollar-denominated debt is also quite low compared with the huge dollar debt burdens of other emerging market economies such as Turkey, Indonesia, and China. Under the steady leadership of central bank head Elvira Nabiullina, the Central Bank of Russia has rebuilt its hard currency reserves after those reserves were severely depleted in 2015 following the collapse in oil prices that began in 2014. Total gold reserves rose from 1,275 tons in July 2015 to about 2,000 tons today. Russia's gold-to-GDP ratio is the highest in the world and more than double those of the US and China. In short, Russia is a country to be reckoned with despite the intense dislike for its leader from Western powers. It can be disliked but it cannot be ignored. Russia is even more important geopolitically than these favorable metrics suggest. Russia and the US are likely to improve relations and move closer together despite the current animosity over election meddling and the attempted murders of ex-Russian spies. The reason for this coming thaw has to do with the dynamics of global geopolitics. There are only 3 countries in the world that are rightly regarded as primary powers: the US, Russia, and China. These 3 are the only superpowers. Some analysts may be surprised to see Russia on the superpower list, but the facts are indisputable. More to the point, Russia is a nuclear superpower, at least on par with the United States and well ahead of China, France, the UK, and other nuclear powers. All others are secondary powers: UK, France, Germany, Japan, Israel, etc., or tertiary powers: Iran, Turkey, India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, etc. This strategic reality sets up a predictable 3-party dynamic. In any 3-party dynamic, whether it's a poker game or a struggle for global control, the dynamic is simple. 2 of the powers align explicitly or implicitly against the third. The 2 aligned powers refrain from using their power against each other in order to conserve it for use against the third power. Meanwhile, the third power, the odd man out, suffers from having to expend military and economic resources to fend off adventurism by both of its opponents with no help from either. China is the greatest geopolitical threat to the US because of its economic and technological advances and its ambition to push the US out of the Western Pacific sphere of influence. Russia may be a threat to some of its neighbors, but it is far less of a threat to US strategic interests. Therefore, a logical balance of power in the world would be for the US and Russia to find common ground in the containment of China and to jointly pursue the reduction of Chinese power. One of the keys to US foreign policy the last 50 or 60 years has been to make sure that Russia and China never form an alliance. Keeping them separated was key, but China and Russia are forging stronger ties through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a military and economic treaty, and the BRICS institutions. The BRICS analogues to the IMF and the World Bank, critical infrastructure, bilateral trade deals, bilateral currency swaps, arms sales, etc. Meanwhile, the US finds itself at odds with both Russia and China over different issues. Who's on the losing end of that? Obviously, the United States. This 2-against-1 strategic alignment of China and Russia against the US is a strategic blunder by the US. The United States has largely withdrawn from the Middle East while Russia has stepped in on Syria and elsewhere. China is expanding in the South China Sea, and Russia is expanding on its periphery. They have each other's back, and the US is the odd man out. But the Russian-Chinese relationship can be exploited. China and Russia have a history of conflicting interests, despite the fact that they were both communist during the Cold War. The two countries had a number of border skirmishes in the 1960s, and one in 1969 was particularly serious. According to a senior Soviet defector to the United States, the Politburo was terrified that the Chinese might make a large-scale intrusion into Soviet territory. The Soviets even considered a preemptive nuclear attack on Chinese nuclear facilities. Soviet officials advised Washington of the possibility, but the US response was firm, warning that any nuclear attack would possibly lead to World War III. The point being, there are fissures in the Chinese-Russian relationship that the US could exploit. For another thing, the US and Russia are the first and second largest energy producers in the world. Saudi Arabia is the third largest energy producer in the world. If you put the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia in a loose alliance, they dominate the energy markets. They can cut you off, they can supply, they can set prices. Who needs energy the most? China. China has very little oil or natural gas. It does have coal, but if you've been to Beijing lately, you know it looks black at noon because the air is so bad and you can't breathe it. Pulmonary disease is becoming fairly common. They're literally choking themselves to death. So, Russia, the US, and Saudi Arabia acting jointly have China completely at their mercy. But the US presently has no relationship with Russia to help back up our position against China. It's 2-against-1, and the US is the odd man out thanks to US political dysfunction and the media. In a three-handed poker game, if you don't know who the sucker is, you're the sucker. Trump will try to make China the odd man out. Very few people seem to get this. As China's power expands and as US power is put to the test in Asia, it is likely that the US will correct its recent strategic short-sightedness and find ways to work with Russia. Or at least it should. This will not be done out of wishful thinking about the true nature of Putin or his regime but as a simple matter of geopolitical necessity. Jim Rickards, China to devalue the yuan until its stock market crashes. Says China will continue to devalue the yuan until the stock market crashes. Here's why the Chinese are doing it. Editor's note, with the recent analysis of the gold price to dollar/yuan correlation, if the plan is to continue to devalue the yuan as the weapon of choice in the trade war, this could have some serious implications for the price of gold. See all of that analysis on our China Controls Gold Price pages. By Jim Rickards of Daily Reckoning. When I say the fix is in for FXI, that's not meant to be mysterious. FXI is the ticker symbol for a U.S. exchange-traded fund, ETF, composed of the largest Chinese stocks. The phrase "the fix is in" simply refers to government-backed manipulation. When you combine the two into a government plan to tank their own stock market, at least to a point, you're as close to a sure thing as stock market indexes allow these days. That's exactly what's going on in China right now. A currency devaluation will likely lead to a stock market collapse, but it's a trade-off China is willing to accept because a cheaper currency will stimulate exports and support jobs. China's motives in market manipulation are about social stability more than profit and loss. Of course, the Chinese have nothing against making money, they're good at it. But China is controlled by a Communist Party dictatorship that is most concerned about its self-perpetuation. That self-perpetuation can involve prison camps, thought control, and torture if needed, but on a day-to-day basis it's more likely to involve avoidance of inflation, unemployment, and market panics, versus slow, steady declines. Investors with vague or no recollection of the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest and massacre Indiana Beijing have been taught to recall the event as a pro-democracy student rally complete with a 33-foot-tall papier-mâché statue called the Goddess of Democracy that was destroyed as the military cleared the square. That's a highly selective and misleading portrait of the overall protest. It's true that student demonstrators placed demands for more freedom of the press and freedom of speech in their petitions. Yet the origins of the protest were economic. Rapid economic growth in the 1980s had resulted in large gains for some but had marginalized and disgruntled many others. Inflation was a real tax on those with limited resources and an easily avoided inconvenience for the rich. It was these economic grievances, inequality and inflation, that gave rise to the protests. The pro-democracy aspects were tacked on in the later stages as the crowds grew. Initially the Communist Party leadership was divided between moderates, like Zhao Ziyang, who favored some dialogue with the protesters, and hardliners, like de facto leader Deng Xiaoping, who favored a forced breakup of the protest and the arrest of its leaders. In the end, the hardliners got the upper hand and the result was a violent military attack on the demonstration. Death estimates vary widely and cannot be verified but range from 1,000 to 10,000 dead protesters. Communist Party leadership itself was thrown into chaos in the aftermath of Tiananmen, with Zhao Ziyang being purged and Jiang Zemin being installed as the new hardline party leader. The ghosts of Tiananmen still haunt the Communist Party leadership almost 30 years later. Economic warfare between China and its trading counterparties is not mainly about economics. It's mainly about social stability in China, which means avoidance of new mass protests and suppression of widely voiced political dissent. This econo-political history brings us to the ongoing trade war between China and the US. A superficial account of the trade war says it was started by President Trump last winter with his imposition of tariffs on Chinese, and other, goods imported into the US, including steel, aluminum, and certain appliances. China retaliated with tariffs on US imports. Trump doubled down with U.S. tariffs on a much longer list of Chinese goods and imposed penalties for Chinese theft of U.S. intellectual property. China retaliated again, and Trump doubled down again. These tit-for-tat tariffs were rising in $10 billion bumps. Suddenly the happy talk about posturing and empty threats was swept aside. A full-scale, red-hot trade war was underway. This recent outline is accurate as far as it goes. Yet it leaves out a much longer and more complicated backstory. On December 11, 2001, China was formally admitted to the World Trade Organization, WTO, the legal successor to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, one of the original Bretton Woods institutions from 1944. China's admission to the WTO was the result of years of negotiations and substantive concessions on the part of China. Despite those perceived concessions, China secretly pursued the same policy it has used at the UN Security Council, the IMF, and other multilateral organizations it has joined in recent years. Here's an easy metaphor that captures Chinese behavior. Imagine you're on the admissions committee at an exclusive club. Your club has a strict dress code that involves jackets, ties, and leather shoes even on casual occasions. A new potential member has applied. They go through the interview process, bring recommendations, are informed about the dress code and agree to strict adherence. The new member is admitted. The next day the new member shows up at the bar in cutoffs, flip-flops and a t-shirt. Your club has a problem. China's the same way. They go through rigorous vetting. The organization rules and procedures are carefully explained. China agrees to play by the rules and is formally admitted. The next day, China proceeds to break every rule in the book and, in effect, dares the leadership to sanction them. The sanctions never arrive. The group has a problem. From this perspective, the trade war did not begin in 2018, it began in 2001. It was not started by President Trump, it was started by China through rule breaking, theft of intellectual property, export dumping and slow-rolling open markets. When China joined the WTO, its trade surplus with the US was about $100 billion per year. Today China's trade surplus with the US is about $400 billion per year and rising. This surplus is in addition to the theft of over $600 billion of intellectual property. The 17-year wealth transfer from the US to China now exceeds $3 trillion. Viewed this way, Trump's 2018 tariffs on China were not the start of a trade war. They were a desperate effort to stop one before the US is looted further by the Chinese. In the short run, China has been able to see Trump's ante every time Trump increases tariffs. Yet China is crucially weak on this front. The US imports about $500 billion per year in goods from China and exports about $100 billion to China. The difference is the $400 billion per year trade deficit the US runs with China. China is getting close to tariffs on 100% of US imports. The US can still impose tariffs on another $400 billion of Chinese imports. This is what Trump referred to when he said the US cannot lose the trade war with China because we already lost. Trump's hope is that China will see it's playing a losing hand, meet Trump for negotiations and settle on lower tariffs all around. This could expand bilateral trade and be a boost to the global economy. So far, China has not sought reconciliation. Instead it has injected a currency war tactic into the trade wars to give it more leverage than would otherwise exist. Here's a chart that shows the radical devaluation of the Chinese yuan, CNY, against the dollar, USD, in the past 4 months. Chart 1. In the past 4 months, the Chinese yuan, CNY, has collapsed 8.5% against the US dollar, USD. From 6.28 to 6.88 per dollar. This is a greater collapse than the August 2015 3% shock devaluation that triggered an 11% US stock market collapse. This new devaluation will continue as part of China's play in the trade wars. This time a Chinese stock collapse is a more likely result. This currency devaluation is China's reply to Trump. If the yuan dropped 20% against the dollar, Chinese export costs would drop by about the same amount because yuan unit labor costs are a huge part of Chinese manufacturing costs. If Chinese export costs are $100 per unit, a 20% devaluation will lower those costs to $80 per unit. A 25% US tariff on the new $80 baseline will raise the export cost to $100 exactly where it started. China has discovered that devaluation is a near-perfect offset to tariffs. The devaluation tactic not only lowers Chinese export costs, it increases US export costs, as shown in Chart 2 below. Chart 2. With the trade wars and currency wars now commingled, what are my predictive analytic models telling us about the prospects for Chinese stocks in particular and China more broadly? Right now, they're telling us that China is not backing down from its aggressive response to Trump's tariffs. The Trump team shows no inclination to back down either. The result will be constricted bilateral trade and slower growth at the margin for both countries. A declining Chinese stock market, as reflected in the FXI price, will be collateral damage in this escalating struggle. It's not a result that China wants, but it's a price they will pay in order to keep Chinese citizens employed and assembly lines humming. Lower unit labor costs combined with higher US tariffs will shift wealth from Chinese enterprises to US importers, but there should be little change in the local currency earnings and job security of Chinese workers. That's the line in the sand the communists will defend. The combined trade and currency wars are like a perfect storm aimed at FXI. Wall Street is misreading these developments, but you don't have to.